Would you appreciate real and honest conversation about how we actually live and experience mitzvot day to day? I'm excited to introduce Women Talking Mitzvot, a new podcast co-produced by L'Nevuchei and Beit Midrash Migdal Oz. In each episode, Rabbanit Shana Goldberg and Rabbanit Dr. Yosefa Fogel-Rubel explore both the texts and the lived experiences of women keeping halacha. They go beyond the sources to ask what it means to take mitzvot seriously without shying away from real-life challenges. And they make it relevant for men as well. Whether you're looking for spiritual or intellectual insight, or just a voice that resonates, Women Talking Mitzvot offers meaningful, grounded conversation, rooted in Torah and lived with authenticity. Listen on your favorite podcast app, or visit deracheha.org. That's DERACHEHA.org. And look out for special episodes going up for Elul and the Yamim Noraim that you do not want to miss. Women Talking Mitzvot. You can find the link in the description of this podcast.
Moshe Rabbeinu's plan, which is really the divine plan, is a very long one and requires a lot of tinkering, not on a active level, but over the course of time, the society changes. The interpretation of the Torah renews itself in each generation according to the times. That isn't to say necessarily the halacha changes, the law, Jewish law changes, but rather the way that society interacts with the Torah can change. And therefore, over time, those laws will develop in a way that will improve society continually.
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is the Orthodox Conundrum. This is the Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. About 4 months ago, we explored Rav Kook's radical ideas with Professor Marc Shapiro. That episode garnered a fair bit of attention, and many people were fascinated by the contemporary resonance of so much of what Rav Kook said a century ago. For that reason, we're now going straight to the source, a work Rav Kook drafted at the turn of the 20th century that he never published in his lifetime, L'Nevuchei HaDor, for the perplexed of the generation. Part of the mystery of L'Nevuchei HaDor is the fact that it was mentioned by students of Rav Kook's in 1935, and then seemingly hidden away and barely referenced at all until it was leaked on the internet in 2010. It was composed when Rav Kook was still in Eastern Europe, and then it went quiet for decades, surfacing in fragmentary ways, debated, partially printed, and only later presented in a fuller Hebrew edition. Along the way, people argued about redactions and censorship. Were sensitive passages softened to protect readers? Was it editorial prudence because the manuscript was unfinished? Or was it an attempt to fit early daring ideas into a later, more canonized and perhaps sanitized version of Rav Kook? We talk through the evidence, but more importantly, the reasons people might have had for holding this material back for so long. Pastoral caution, fear of misreading, financial considerations, ideological anxieties, and the simple fact that Rav Kook often was way ahead of his time. And then we dive into the ideas themselves, like Rav Kook's beliefs that other religions contain truth, and that there has been divine inspiration among writers of many faiths. We talk about how he handles clashes between moral intuition and Torah, the tension between his acceptance of the idea of the descent of the generations and his belief that society is growing in its moral sophistication, why heresy can purify faith, and a unique approach to the problems that arise when ancient Near East texts appear to be quite similar to what's written in the Torah. But perhaps more important than any of Rav Kook's ideas and solutions is his unique methodology of addressing questions, fearlessly and with a remarkable openness to experimenting with fresh approaches and ideas. My guest today is Rabbi Aryeh Sklar, who extensively researched and translated L'Nevuchei HaDor. Rabbi Sklar was a student of mine in the yeshiva I used to run with Rabbi Pesach Wolicki, Yeshivat Yisodei HaTorah. He attended the yeshiva both as a student and later as a madrich. He started studying L'Nevuchei HaDor as a student at our yeshiva, and while he did spend time in my shiur, and while I wish I could take credit for his discovery of Rav Kook, in actual fact, I had nothing to do with teaching him Rav Kook. That honor belongs to my colleague and good friend, Rabbi Wolicki. Still, it's a real honor and pleasure to see how Rabbi Sklar has grown into a real expert in the thought of Rav Kook, and I experienced true nachat as I learned from him during this conversation. Today's discussion is partially a detective story about a secret manuscript that was hidden for over 100 years, partially an analysis of Rav Kook's ideology and approach to the modern world, and partially a guide to teach us Rav Kook's unique and very relevant attitude towards difficult questions, whatever they may be. And we'll get to that conversation in a moment. First, I'm excited to announce that we at Jewish Coffee House are continuing to expand the conversation by bringing you, our listeners, into the mix, introducing JCH Q&A, an exciting new podcast where listener-submitted questions are answered in a thoughtful, honest, and engaging way. We plan to dive deep into your pressing hashkafic, political, and philosophical questions. We're looking to address the ideas that matter, the issues that challenge us, and the topics that spark real curiosity. Nothing is off limits, and all submissions will remain anonymous. To submit a question for our first episode, you must be a member of the JCH Podcast WhatsApp community. To join, look for the link in the description of this podcast. We look forward to receiving your questions. Remember to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please rate it and write a review. Continue the conversation on Facebook by joining the Orthodox Conundrum discussion group. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. Finally, in 2025, the best way to promote your organization, your business, or yourself is to create a high-quality podcast, and JCH Podcast Productions can help you make that happen. Whether you want to learn how to start your own podcast or want to improve the podcast you already produce, we will make it happen. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. Rabbi Aryeh Sklar is a writer and educator living in Jerusalem with his wife Michal and two boys, Avichai and Itai. When he isn't teaching his gap year students at Yeshivat Eretz HaTzvi, he writes and edits for various organizations, including the Steinsaltz Center, where he helps produce Rav Adin Steinsaltz's commentaries and works for the English-speaking public. Rabbi Aryeh Sklar, thank you very much for joining me today on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
I'd like to ask you about the book you just translated, L'Nevuchei HaDor by Rav Kook. What is it exactly? Realizing, of course, that it's an entire book, so you could take hours to summarize it, but essentially, what is this book and where does it fit into Rav Kook's thought in general? And why did you think it was important to translate it into English?
L'Nevuchei HaDor literally means for the perplexed of the generation. It wasn't a name that was given by Rav Kook. This is a manuscript that he wrote sometime before he made Aliyah. Best guess is around 1903, 1904. He made Aliyah in 1904. And he was bothered by certain questions that he was experiencing. People were coming to ask him clearly in the town of Boysk, where he was serving as a rabbi. And clearly he saw that there was an issue here of people who were bothered by nationalism. There was the Zionist movement was picking up steam. There was already the Zionist Congress that was meeting every year. Herzl's work was lighting the Jewish world on fire. And on the other hand, the religious world was not keeping to pace with this kind of development. That's just one issue that he wanted to deal with. Another issue is the new knowledge that was being discovered in science, and not just empirical science, but also there was a new development of psychology. Sigmund Freud, who I don't think ever mentions by name, but certainly was thinking of these new psychological developments, realization of what's going on in the inner consciousness that Rav Kook was concerned about. And he saw that his constituents were concerned about this in his town of Boysk. He writes several times in different letters around this time to his father-in-law, the Aderet, Rav Eliyahu David Ta'omim Rabinowitz. He tells him, I want to write these pamphlets maybe to explain these things, these different issues in a way that makes sense to these young people, many of them young, but confused, perplexed people who want to understand why there's this gap between the religious understanding and what they're writing, what they're producing in their newspapers, and how we're feeling on the ground. This growing feeling that we have to go back to the land of Israel. The growing feeling that there is this modernity in the air that we have to take a part of. And so he started clearly at that point already in the 1890s to write this book. He had written a book of sermons from when he was in Zaimel. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. Also in the Latvia region in the Russian Empire. He was a rabbi there, and he had given sermons in his synagogue, wrote them down clearly. I think the book is called Midbar Shor, and clearly it was not given over the way that it's written down. It's much more flowing. It's many more sources, several dozen pages sometimes. I don't know if people wanted to sit in the pews and listen to that kind of sermon. So obviously he was adding to it, and he writes in the introduction to that work, which was already only published relatively recently. He writes in that introduction that he wants to write a book of philosophy that is talking about the issues of the day in a more systematic way, instead of as almost like commentary to midrashim and words of the sages and of the parsha and of the holidays, which he had in this book Midbar Shor. Apparently, that's when it started. In 1899 was when he wrote that introduction. So sometime between 1899 and 1904, when he made Aliyah, he was developing this kind of idea. And there we have it. We have a book, a manuscript that since that time we have not heard of until it was leaked onto the internet in 2010.
Before we go any further, I want to hear more about that very strange circumstance of a book that was written no later than 1904, and then it disappeared for over 100 years before emerging on the internet in 2010. What happened?
Okay, so in 1935, when Rav Kook died, soon after his passing, a document was produced, a protocol describing all the works that were, so to speak, in the works. They were working on getting them published, or at least these were left over to be published. For example, Ein Ayah, Rav Kook's commentary to the Gadata, which was eventually published, but many other works included there. And one of them was this mysterious document called L'Nevuchei HaDor, the new guide for the perplexed. And this committee that put together this protocol were all students of Rav Kook. They were all supporters and followers of his, and putting this out, that was very exciting, but nobody knew exactly what it was. And in fact, many different students of his son, Rav Yehuda Kook, gave different answers for what exactly was contained within it. Rav Moshe Tzvi Neria gave one answer, and Rav Gutol and another gave a different answer of, is it about Tameh and Mitzvot? It is a little bit, or a lot of it. There's a good amount of the reasons, the rationale for the mitzvot in there. Is it a book that didn't quite come to be? There was a little bit here and a little bit there, but not systematic. It's pretty systematic, so it wasn't quite that. Did it include several essays? Rav Moshe Tzvi Neria thought that it included other essays included inside of it. Not exactly. It has its own complete work. So in 1935, all we know is L'Nevuchei HaDor. And that's very exciting. It's a guide for the perplexed. And then over time, over the next few decades, we don't hear anything about it. Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook never talks about it, as far as we know from letters and from his students. We have different students of Rav Kook. Rav Yoshua Hutner mentions it in Chazon HaGeula, which is a compilation of Rav Kook's ideas. And we basically don't, and the Nazir as well, the Rav David Cohen, the Nazir of Jerusalem, also mentions it in his commentary to his commentary to the Kuzari. This L'Nevuchei HaDor. Okay, so nobody knows about it. No, Rav Tzvi Yehuda never talked about it, and some people even denied the existence of such a work, as if it was just put on as protocols and it never truly existed. Then we come to 2010. 2010, this manuscript that apparently had been worked on by a student of Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook, whose name is Rabbi Shachar Rahmani, was working on this dissertation, and the story isn't exactly clear, but it was stolen from him and leaked onto the internet. Was it somebody who was working with him on his doctorate, on his dissertation? It's not clear. But once it was on the internet, it took the world by storm, or the Rav Kook world, I should say, by storm. And Rav Eitan Henkin actually wrote a quasi-introduction to this work, summarizing what was on in it. How can we date it? How do we know that it's sometime around 1903 and 1904? Comparing it to other works of Rav Kook, placing it in the time of Boysk in the early 1900s was also done in this essay. And in fact, I got permission from Rav Eitam Henkin's mother, Rabbinit Henkin, to translate it into English and publish it as part of this book. And I'm very grateful to her that I was able to do that, which really adds to the book. At the end of the introduction, Rav Henkin says that he hopes that this serves as an introduction to future works such as L'Nevuchei HaDor. So I'm hoping to be able to fulfill this. And he describes a lot of this history as well. That was just a few months after it was published. So he read it very quickly, already knew many of the relevant letters of Rav Kook. That it's unbelievable the knowledge that Rav Eitam had to be able to pull together such an article like this. And I pulled from it a lot actually in my own introduction until I decided to translate his and just use that as the introduction because I think it was perfect. In 2014, the dissertation was completed by Rabbi Shachar Rachmani, and he also, as part of this dissertation, published the book, which he named L'Nevuchei HaDor. Not More L'Nevuchei HaChadash, but L'Nevuchei HaDor, for the perplexed of the generation. Rav Kook had not given a title himself, apparently, in the manuscript. It was the students of Rav Kook in that protocols that decided to call it that. Rabbi Shachar Rachmani felt that it was a little pretentious to call it almost like a restatement of Moreh Nevuchim, the Maimonides magnum opus, some would call it. And so he wanted to call it something else, and he found language in several chapters. Rav Kook talks about the perplexed of his generation, and so he called it L'Nevuchei HaDor. So that was 2014, and starting already when it was leaked, I started learning it in yeshiva. In yeshiva, there was a Rabbi Pesach Walicki, who you know well because he was your co-Rosh Yeshiva. I'm telling everybody else about the relationship. And I was honored to be part of a group who learned with him this work of Rav Kook. And actually, I think people might be surprised nowadays to find out, since I have written this book and I've commented on Rav Kook's writings in other places, that was actually my first foray into Rav Kook's writings. What an introduction it is. And really started to get to know Rav Kook when I sat down with actually some of the people in that group and decided to start translating it with some of them actually. And I learned how to be a project manager a little bit and how it's very difficult to get volunteers for writing projects. And I think a lot of writers and editors might know the feeling of trying to pull together where's that article, how do we get it to the finishing stages. And we got a few chapters done by the end of the year. Unfortunately, I had hoped it would be a present to Rabbi Walicki as a full translation of the book, not realizing in my naivety exactly how much work would go into something like that. And here we are in 2025, fully almost 15 years later, and the book has finally been complete.
Well, that's fantastic. Let me ask a question before we get into the contents of the book, and this leads to that question. Why was it hidden, to the best of our knowledge, for all of those years? And I'm referring to two specific stages. Rav Kook himself obviously didn't publish it for the 31 years after he had written it. And then from 1935 until 2010, those 75 years, it was not even mentioned by Reb Tzvi Yehuda and most of the students of Rav Kook's. So what's the reason that Rav Kook himself didn't publish it, as best we know? And what's the reason that his students chose not to publish it over those years?
Okay, so as for why Rav Kook himself didn't publish it, so as we said, he had written it right before he made Aliyah, just a few short years before he made Aliyah. In fact, he had been editing it. That's a very rare thing in Rav Kook writings. If you look at manuscripts for Rav Kook, you'll almost never see cross-outs. You'll never see additions on the page, except maybe by his son or something like that, or from some editor who's putting the markings in to be able to bring it to publishing. But Rav Kook rarely ever edited his own writing. It was almost like it was from, inspiration from above through his mind to his pen without any interruption. This book, L'Nevuchei HaDor, the manuscript, a very unique thing about this work is that there are crossouts and there are additional lines that are inserted in. Rav Kook clearly wanted to publish it. But then he made Aliyah. And even if you want to publish something, if you move to a different country, you have other concerns going on. Became, I think it's called, they called him the chief rabbi of Yaffo, but at least he was the rabbi of Yaffo and the surrounding settlements. And he might have had other concerns going on at the time. That's number one, is that you move from one place to another. That's a big upheaval. That's a big change. You're not always able to get back to the projects that you were doing before. Number two is that, of course, he experienced a very different type of person in the land of Israel than he was experiencing in Boysk. It could very well be that he was not encountering the same kinds of issues that he was encountering in Boysk. Certainly not as vociferously as in Boysk, meaning people were passionate about the issues of science and Torah, about biblical criticism, about evolution, about determinism, about psychology and nationalism. Nationalism certainly was on the minds of a lot of Jews in Israel, in the land of Israel, but maybe not to the extent that they felt that there was a contradiction between their religion and living in the land of Israel. He might have been worrying about really the chilonim, the people who were completely not religious. The person he was writing his book to, presumably, was somebody who was religious and was perplexed. Does this fit with my nationalism? Does this fit with the scientific progress that I believe in? That person probably was not as much on his mind in Israel when he was dealing with a tremendous population of completely non-religious Jews, even sometimes anti-religious Jews who didn't want to hear any Yiddish, who didn't want any rabbis to come to their kibbutzim, who were driving and having movies and whatever was going on in the time in Israel, whatever the things that they were doing on Shabbat. Rav Kook had to deal with those kinds of issues, which might have required a different kind of response. There are certainly elements in the book that would work for those kinds of people, for the secular, anti-religious people, certainly, but perhaps it required a different touch, a different nuance. Third of all, there's a lot of other issues here. Probably the main one that people talk about is the financial issue. Rav Kook, surprisingly, perhaps to people who think of him as such a big rabbi, was very poor. He gave away a lot of money. He gave a lot of tzedakah. But also, it's not, think about living in the land of Israel at the turn of the century. It wasn't exactly a very wealthy economy. And it cost a lot of money to publish a book. The books that he did publish once he was already in Israel were done mostly for purposes such as the passing of the Aderet, who we mentioned before, his father-in-law. He published the book of Eder Yakar, where he collected different writings of his father-in-law and different ideas, and included in that some essays of his own. But it was on an occasion of something. It wasn't just on its own. And when he published Orot, that was as the chief rabbi. He wanted to, part of the purpose of it was to establish himself as a voice in Israel and to talk about the holiness of Israel, which was less pertinent in L'Nevuchei HaDor, less talked about in L'Nevuchei HaDor. So probably financially, it would have been much harder to publish.
I just want to say that is an interesting idea, which we don't ever think about nowadays in a world where self-publishing is, relatively speaking, extraordinarily cheap. Anyone can publish anything if they have a printer in their house, practically. The idea that he didn't publish it, maybe he wanted to, but it was just too expensive, is such a prosaic, easy answer, and probably the most obvious answer when we think about it. It's hard to put ourselves back into that time so many years ago.
It's true. And in fact, we have a letter of Rav Kook saying that he wishes to publish Einaya, the commentary on the Agadata, that he had spent a lot of time already writing and would spend until the last years of his life even continuing to write. But he wanted to publish it, but he didn't have the financial means. He actually says that in a letter. So we know that that was a concern of his and that prevented him from being able to publish writings. Why this answer can't be the full answer is that there are many letters of his, several letters, where he talks about the need for books of Jewish philosophy, where they need to explain the different ideas of the time. And he even says in a letter, I only wrote a few meager essays about this. If he wrote a full book about it, you would think that he would actually say something about it. He would actually say, I have a book. Maybe it's not as relevant as it used to be. Maybe I can update it. But he doesn't say any of that. He says, I wrote a few notes here and there. I wrote a few essays. And this is a full book. So it's a little strange that Rav Kook himself kind of cast it aside or forgot about it in some way. If it was just financial, maybe it would have been on his mind. Maybe we would have evidence of him instructing his children when we get the means, when in future, I hope that this can be published eventually, but he doesn't. And what's also strange is that Tzvi Yehuda doesn't publish it in his lifetime, although he was very reluctant generally to publish the early writings of his father. He felt that there was a difference in style and in divine grace, even divine inspiration of the writings that Rav Kook wrote in Israel versus the writings that he wrote outside of Israel before he was in Israel. So it is a little strange. It doesn't fully answer the question if it was just purely financial. I was having a conversation with somebody about this, and I said, he should have mentioned in his letters if he cared about it, if he was ready to publish it and just needed a little bit more work. And that person said, when else does he really talk about his writings? And it's true. Rav Kook doesn't talk about his unpublished works very often. He has them in manuscript. I'm told that there are uncountable amounts of pages of Rav Kook's writings that are scattered all over in his different followers and in Merkaz Harav. So there's possibly many other works that we don't even know about because Rav Kook never mentioned and they were never published and we don't have them. So it's possible that he never talked about it because he just doesn't talk about his works. But even when he has letters where he should have talked about it because he mentions books of philosophy, he doesn't mention it. So there's still a mystery there that doesn't fully resonate with me, the financial angle. Perhaps it was that he was experiencing different people and therefore there needed to be different answers. Shachar Rachmani adds an additional possibility that in Edar Yakar, which we mentioned as a tribute to his father-in-law, many of the ideas from L'Nevuchei HaDor end up there. So certainly it was still on Rav Kook's mind. And in fact, much of the same language ends up there. So issues having to do with archaeology, issues and new discoveries and how they impact the Torah, issues having to do with the Sanhedrin and the power of the Sanhedrin to revamp laws. I'm sure we're going to talk about many of these things. Many of those issues come up in Edar Yakar. So Rav Rachmani suggests that maybe he felt he covered it. Not all the issues that he had in his book, but many of them. So maybe he didn't feel like he needed to publish its own work. All possible. I have one additional point I wanted to make. One of the ways that they've dated this work of Rav Kook to probably around 1903 and 1904 is that he alludes to the Uganda scheme, the Uganda plan. The Uganda plan was proposed by Chamberlain and then Herzl as a possible place for the Jewish people to set up a state in Uganda, which apparently is not the Uganda of today, but somewhere else. But anyway, there was this suggestion in the air. It had not yet been laughed out of the World Zionist Congress, and Rav Kook alludes to it several times as a possibility. That could be a place where he would say, I support this as a temporary pit stop on the way to Eretz Israel, on the way to the land of Israel, but that might be a good idea for us to build up our strength, build up our national identity before the land of Israel becomes available to us. And he says it over, I think I found at least 3 references. Some people have pointed out 2 of them, chapter 44 and chapter 46. There might be one also in chapter 50. But he mentions this idea, the possibility of creating a state somewhere else and then bring those people, once it's ready, to Israel. So the possibility, I thought maybe that he didn't support that anymore. And it's at least in the later chapters, it's throughout those later chapters, this Uganda plan, that with the support of it, and not really a lot of people supported it later, especially once Rav Kook ended up in Israel, in the land of Israel, and saw that there was a need to build up this land that he was living in. Maybe he didn't want to include those chapters, and it would have required some work going through, making sure to take out those references. And perhaps he delayed that and didn't mention it. And I wouldn't say was embarrassed by it, but was not fully supportive of those previous ideas.
Very, very interesting. I want to ask you then, if that's true, then Rav Kook didn't necessarily want to publish it. Why are we publishing it now? Meaning, if this is something which Rav Kook himself obviously was either reluctant to publish or decided he had better things to do, given that there's a possibility that maybe he said this is no longer relevant or I'm embarrassed by this, is it right for us to look at something which he himself allowed to be hidden?
Yeah, that's a really important question. Is it something that he specifically didn't want to publish, or would have published had he had the money and he had the time to go through it and edit it? That's a question that we can't answer. Rav Tzvi Yehuda, would he have published it? I don't know. What I will say is that clearly the students of Rav Kook did not feel that this work was something that was off the table. They listed in that protocols and those protocols. The students of Rav Tzvi Yehuda eventually published it into a book. Shachar Rahmani, Rabbi Rahmani, is a student of Rav Tzvi Yehuda, and he also publishes it into a book, part of a dissertation. It doesn't seem like this was something that the followers of Rav Kook and his son were completely against. Now, maybe we should mention some of the censorship. Should we get into that?
Before we go there, one quick question. Are we sure that he actually wrote this? I know that sounds like an obvious question, but is there anyone who claims it's not actually Rav Kook who wrote this? And it's actually, I'm not sure the right term is a forgery, but something which is attributed to Rav Kook, but really somebody else close to Rav Kook wrote it?
We have the manuscript.
We have the original manuscript.
We have the original manuscript. I tried to get permission from Rabbi Rahmani, who worked on the original manuscript when he was using it for his dissertation and to publish it. I tried to get some permission from him to be able to publish some of the pages. You can see Rav Kook's handwriting. It's unlike really any other. Very, very flowy, very interesting ways of using kuffs and other things. You can do a handwriting analysis, I'm sure, to determine this 100%, but just from a glance, you could see it's Rav Kook's writing. And so I haven't held the book, the notebook that he wrote it in, but from how it's described, it seems like it is one of the regular notebooks that Rav Kook would have used, and with his pen and all the things that you can name. And also, it's very difficult, I find, to copy the exact style of the way that someone writes, especially when they're constantly quoting and referencing words of the sages, words of the Torah, constantly flowing with those ideas in a way that is reminiscent of so many other writings of the same person. Maybe AI can do this better than we can today, but it certainly sounds like Rav Kook in every sense. There's also turns of phrases of Rav Kook that are unique to him, that nobody ever uses in this work, that you'll find in throughout his life, that he always used. Litor v'lechituv is an interesting one. He talks about the need for sculpting and art. He talks about that in this book, and that exact line is used in several other places as well. Who would make this up? They would write a notebook that would have his handwriting, that would have his turns of phrases, and would reference this kind of language of the need for art in the exact same way as Rav Kook, unless someone was a genius and on par with Rav Kook. I don't think.
In which case, it's worth reading anyway.
Maybe.
Okay, so let's talk about censorship a little bit.
Okay, so we were just talking about how it wasn't published. Maybe it shouldn't have been published. I accept the argument completely that Rav Kook probably did not want to publish it as it is now. Probably wanted to work on it more. He had started, but clearly didn't complete it. For example, many chapters, maybe we call them out of order. The first chapter talks about the creation of the world and free will and determinism, and the various ideas that are necessary for religious life through that. And then the second chapter and the third chapter talk about the need to write books that take the ideas of Maimonides and Rabbi Judah Halevi and Rabbi Saadia Gaon, and take these works that they had written on philosophy in the medieval times and update them for today. That sounds like a very programmatic statement. You would think that that would be the first and second chapter, but instead it's this first chapter. Then he talks about these almost like introduction to his work type of comments. And then a fourth chapter right afterwards that returns to the same topic from a different angle. So certainly that's just one piece of evidence that Rav Kook was still working on this. I accept the argument that maybe not every comment he had, he would want to put in this work. On the other hand, there were the students of Rav Tzvi Yehuda, who are part of a publishing house, Machon Rav Tzvi Yehuda, who took this manuscript and they took out whatever chapters they found controversial. And sometimes you can't figure out what exactly is so controversial about them. But one example is Rav Kook talks a lot about comparative religions. He talks about Christianity and Islam. And unlike many of, I think, what we would expect of a very Orthodox, traditional man wearing a bakasha and a shtreimel, Rav Kook accepts the validity of these religions and thinks that the adherents to those religions should stay adherents to those religions, that they have something about them that is very moral and keeps their people in a very good light, that raises them up to higher levels. This kind of idea was completely taken out of the work that was published by the students of Tzvi Yehuda in Pinkasei Raya Volume 2. I have it right here. It's a pretty thin volume. It actually has L'Nevuchei HaDor and another notebook of Rav Kook from his time in Jerusalem.
And that's not the Rahmani edition.
This is not the Rahmani edition. This is from the students of Rav Tzvi Yehuda, from the Machona of Rav Tzvi Yehuda, while the Pinkasei Raya version does say where we changed some of the language, or we left some things out that we want to explain later, but they never ended up explaining it later. And then Rabbi Rahmani's version came out. So they take out comparative religions. They take out controversy. He talks about the power, the authority of the Sanhedrin to revamp, to update the laws of the Torah according to the times, which clearly is a controversial idea. And how he deals with this from a traditional perspective is very fascinating. And there are several other, those are major chapters that are taken out of the book. And several times it's just a sentence that they didn't like, an idea that didn't fit or they felt was too controversial. So a lot of these times, though, they're stated elsewhere in Rav Kook's writings. They're already published somewhere else. And instead, they were taken out here, even though they didn't seem to be so controversial there. I have a feeling that this is pure speculation, but that when you have a book like L'Nevuchei HaDor, people are going to look at that as Rav Kook's philosophy. When you have a comment in a notebook somewhere else that happens to be about this topic, people are going to say, okay, Rav Kook was musing there, was contemplating the idea. But here, it's being stated as, this is my response of the time. So I think that they felt the need and the permission to take out these ideas, and whether that is permitted and allowed is a question.
And what year was that Pinkasei Raya version of the students of Tzvi Yehuda published?
Yeah, so the leak came out in 2010. I want to say this came out in 2011, perhaps also 2010. It was quickly after. Tuf Shin Ayin, I think that's 2010 as well. So very quickly after. Clearly, they had been working on it in parallel to the work Shachar Rahmani was working on. I don't think they expected that people would be able to so quickly compare their work to the leaked version and see exactly what was taken out. And Rav Eitam Henkin points out that this actually caused more controversy, because now you see what they've been doing. Now you see that this could have been done in other places. And it's pretty worrying that we're getting a version of Rav Kook that is cultivated by others. Again, can we necessarily say it's so negative? We have to put it in perspective. They were trying to protect Rav Kook's image, but on the other hand, this is something that Rav Kook wrote. He was preparing it for publication. If he thought that this chapter should be taken out completely, I don't think he would have written it. If he thought that it should be explained more, I would agree with that. And that's why it's important to have commentary, which I provide very helpfully, hopefully, in my book.
Very, very interesting. Okay, before we get into some of the specific ideas, I have one last question about the whole censorship issue and the process of publication, which is that this is a book that was written at the latest 121 years ago. That is a very, very dated book in a sense when we're talking about modern problems that are perplexing people of our generation. He was talking to people who would have died many, many, many years ago and who were perplexed by issues that probably are not at the forefront of people's minds today. So given that, does it speak to people today, or is this an historical artifact that's interesting, but it doesn't necessarily speak to the philosophical questions that people in our postmodernist world are dealing with today in 2025?
So let me answer that on two levels. Number one is, let me tell you a little bit about myself. Before I do that, let me tell you a little bit about Betzalel Naor. Rabbi Naor is a famous translator, a well-known translator into English of Rav Kook's writings. And he's been, I don't know, call him an idol of mine, or somebody I really look up to, because he was capable of taking very, very tough language of Rav Kook and putting it into the English language in a very poetic way. And he writes in one of his works, I think it was in his work on Rav Kook and the freedom of thought. He says in the introduction that people always ask him, how did he get into Rav Kook? How did that start for him? And he says that when he was in yeshiva, he felt like he was closed off. He felt like he didn't have the ability to open himself up to new ideas and to the ideas of Chassidut and to the broad philosophies that were around him. And he felt in yeshiva he was being blocked from that. And then he comes home and he has this dusty old Igrot Haraya, the letters of Rav Kook, and he starts opening the pages, and he felt that Rav Kook was speaking to him in a way that he had never felt before, in a way that he felt that it was possible to open himself up to ideas that he had never thought of before, that he could think in new ways, that he felt in his society, in his yeshiva, that was not allowed. And Rav Kook was a guiding light for him. Okay, so for him, that was the letters of Rav Kook. For me, it's L'Nevuchei HaDor. And it's not so much of the content. It's not so much of exactly what he says, but how he says it. And I wouldn't say it's not about the poetry. Oh, wow, he really, there is poetry there and it's beautiful. But I would say that I came from almost an opposite problem to Rabbi Naor. He felt closed off. And I felt that there was too much. There's Kabbalah, there's the Zohar, there's the Rambam, and there's rationalist philosophy, and all of these different factions in Judaism. I felt when I was in yeshiva and afterwards as a kind of, there's these so many different factions. There's so much division. How can we call this the religion called Judaism when it seems to be so not just conservative, reform, Orthodox, or reconstructionists, add on in any sect that you want, but also within Orthodoxy, which is where I was living, where I am. I was feeling that there were these people who were doing something completely different than me, believing in something completely different than me. And I felt like I had these two sides to myself of a maybe more mystical Judaism and a more rationalist Judaism fighting for dominance. And that was very difficult for me. And then this book showed me that you can actually believe in both. It's possible to have a more mystical mindset within rationalist philosophy, where you can read the Rambam as being much broader than maybe the Rambam would have read himself, would have allowed for. And it's possible to take Chassidut and the Mitnagdim and put those together and create a third possibility that gets the best of both. And that's what Rav Kook does so many times in this book, where he takes a problem of a clash of ideas and finds a solution that accepts the best of both. And just that alone is something that could speak to so many people today of that struggle with these various ideas in Judaism.
So on some level, would you say it's almost less the specific answers as the process that he's utilizing in order to get to those answers?
Exactly. Yes. Thank you for putting it in a quick way. Besides for that, of course, there are maybe what we call dated ideas. What he's most concerned about in the beginning of the book is this idea of free will and determinism. What was very popular at the time, still is in science, the philosophy of science, but people are less concerned about it today, or less thinking about it today. But the idea that the world is cause and effect, everything happens because of the thing that happened before it, and that we don't have real choice. That's certainly something that exists today, but it was at the forefront of people's minds at the turn of the century because there was no idea of yet of intelligent design or a belief that even within the rules of the universe, there is a godly force. And so therefore, people struggled with this idea. Do we have free will? And if we don't have free will, what's the Torah's rewards and punishment? How can we be asked to keep the Torah if we don't actually have free will? And so Rav Kook deals with this issue, which I don't think is at the forefront of so many people's minds today. On the other hand, here's something that's on the forefront of people's minds. First of all, nationalism. That's something that is still people are wondering about the place of Zionism today in even among Jews, among religious Jews, about how much do we have to live in the land of Israel? Why are all these people asking us to make aliyah? There are some people who are saying, I'm going to stay in the diaspora as much as possible. That's still an issue today, as much as it was in Rav Kook's time. And that's something that he deals with a lot in the book, to deal with the morality of nationalism and the need for the Jewish people to have a state. And not only that, but we have lots of discoveries, scientific discoveries today that Rav Kook talks about biblical criticism. So post-dating the Torah from the time that it was written to a much later date. And part of the proofs for this is the discovery of stories that exist outside of the Torah, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh and Hammurabi's Code. That's not even stories, there's laws that sound very similar to the Torah. And people in the turn of the century, even to today, will read those, will see those, and say, it must be the Torah is just part of the same genre, and it was written not from God, but from men, just as much as Hammurabi's Code was, and just as much as the Epic of Gilgamesh. And Rav Kook has a response here that should serve us for a lot of our questions of these kinds of discoveries, which is, how do you know that those people weren't also inspired by God to write what they wrote? Who told you that there weren't people in the time before Abraham who weren't inspired by God? There are plenty of people, and he names, and Noah, and everybody, all the genealogy after him. There are these great men that are described in the Torah. Maybe they wrote a book. Maybe they have ideas that are similar to the Torah because the divine voice is flowing through them as well. And so it's possible that you'll have these similarities because there's divinity everywhere. There's a divinity of all sorts, of all different kinds of people, maybe a little bit mistaken, maybe a little bit blurred, but the Torah is there to come filter those stories out into the appropriate ones that are correct for at least the Jewish people.
That's a fascinating insight. In other words, you're saying that Rav Kook's view is something like the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's not that we have to say that it was borrowed from the Torah or that it is describing the same events from a different perspective and historical events so much as saying that maybe the author had a form of Ruach HaKodesh himself, a form of divine inspiration, however that's defined, and therefore he's writing down ideas that are godly, and the Torah takes it and says this is the pure, unadulterated, unfiltered idea as it should be. And that was an approximation of the same idea given to someone who was a holy person in his own way. Is that what you're saying?
Right. Exactly. And what's fascinating about it is that he's saying that over time, those prophets were, their prophecies were corrupted. Ours was not, of course, but theirs was. And these people had nations. And so those nations passed down these stories and wrote them down in incorrect ways. And so it's the Torah's mission to kind of like raise these up and show that there are actually ways to understand. It doesn't have to do with the actual event itself, but how it fixes those stories, which is more fascinating.
It's very interesting. That reminds me a bit, lahavdil, but C.S. Lewis in describing from a Christian perspective how it is that the Christian origin story is echoed or maybe precipitated by many other stories in pagan cultures of a similar idea of a God dying and being resurrected. He says those are good dreams. It was almost the collective subconscious of humanity figuring out something inherent in the universe. Now, obviously, I'm not agreeing with the specific case over there, but the concept is the same, which is that there is an idea of people outside of our particular religious community having what C.S. Lewis would call good dreams, what Kook would call them perhaps a form of Ruach HaKodesh, which anticipates those things that later on will be presented in their true and unadulterated form.
Yes, very fascinating. Rav Kook, I've connected this in the book to the introduction to Rabbi Nachman of Breslov's stories. He has these fascinating stories, allegories of that are super detailed, unbelievably detailed, and each thing refers to something else. And in the introduction, it was written by a student, he says that Rabbi Nachman believed that many fairy tales actually have some kind of kernel of some truth that is true, a universal truth. And over time, they became these fairy tales, which are, very pagan sometimes, very foolish in some ways. And it takes a certain amount to look into those stories and find that kernel of truth. And so Rabbi Nachman was doing that in his stories, finding the truth in those kind of universal ideas, universal stories, and expanding them as they relate to the Jewish people and to very deep ideas.
I think it's clear that Rabbi Nachman wasn't being original in many of these stories in terms of the actual story. The originality is that he reimagined it in such a way that existing European folktales or fairy tales acquired a new Kabbalistic meaning through the way that he told it.
Right. So he was purifying those. So Rav Kook felt that that was going on in the Torah as well. It was taking these stories, God taking these stories and saying, first of all, I don't think Rav Kook actually mentions that were the Jewish people aware of these stories at the time, but certainly they existed, and the Torah is giving you the true, actual version of it. Taking the kernel of truth that existed then and to lots of other prophets and putting them in the Torah in the version that it should be. Let me actually add to this beyond that Rav Kook has this idea in this book. He has it in other places as well, but it's very well said here, that he thinks that the Torah was written in a way that is supposed to be it's supposed to broaden and grow with the Jewish people. It was written in a way kind of like Moshe Rabbeinu was the most wise and the most connected to the divine person, to be able to know that if he puts a law here, these are the effects of that law over time and the changing of society, such that in 2,000 years, it's going to apply in a certain way that it wouldn't have applied in his own time. Rav Kook here doesn't reference the story of Rabbi Akiva and Moshe Rabbeinu, the Agadata, the famous one, of Moshe Rabbeinu being transported into the classroom of Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Akiva claiming that the laws that he is expounding came from Moshe himself, and Moshe doesn't know what to do with that when he hears the laws until he finds out that they actually came from him. In other words, Moshe Rabbeinu's plan, which is really the divine plan, is a very long one and requires a lot of tinkering, not on a active level, but over the course of time, the society changes. The interpretation of the Torah renews itself in each generation according to the times. That isn't to say necessarily the halacha changes, the Jewish law changes, but rather the way that society interacts with the Torah can change. And therefore, over time, those laws will develop in a way that will improve society continually.
If I can ask if this is one of the examples, because I believe from Marc Shapiro's book, he mentioned this one, if I recall correctly. I know Rabbi Zatzal talks about this, not necessarily in reference to Rav Kook, but an example of that might be the Torah's allowance of slavery, but according to them, the fact that it included the seeds of the dissolution of slavery. In other words, the Torah is fundamentally, they would argue, an anti-slavery book, but it allowed slavery for various reasons, including the fact that society wasn't ready for the absolute abolition and abolishment of slavery. Society wasn't prepared for an absolute rejection of slavery yet. But it included within it the seeds of slavery's eventual destruction, such that you can say not having slaves today is a Torah idea, even though the Torah allows slavery, paradoxically, because of that societal evolution that allows us to take that initial idea in the Torah and develop it. Is that correct?
So he doesn't talk about that part, the slavery specifically in the book. The overall theory is correct that, and I put in some footnotes about slavery as well, but that morality, since it changes over time, since it's based in the internal system of the Jewish people, of the individual and of the nation, that will affect the law, how the law is practiced, how the law is seen by the people, I should say. And so in a letter, he does have this idea of slavery as being fundamentally not a ideal of the Jewish people, but it was on its way to developing to being something that would tell people, hey, slavery is not good. I mean, if you just read the Torah, you come away with a puzzle, because it's all about the Jewish people coming out of the land of Egypt, being enslaved, and how terrible that was, and coming into a land of freedom with the Torah. And then some of the first laws that you're taught is about slavery and how to handle a slave. And so very sensitive readers would realize, if they already have the worldview that slavery is a moral evil, that this is something that the Torah clearly does not want. But why is it there? So Rav Kook writes in a letter that it was supposed to develop the Jewish people over time, then be a light unto the world. He actually says in that letter, it's very fascinating, that because of the destruction of the temple, the Jewish people could no longer represent that value of anti-slavery, and that's how it went wild in the world. Maybe thinking of the last generation before him, and a lot of civil wars that occurred because of it. But Rav Kook actually says it turns into a monster. It changed because there was nobody guiding the morality of slavery into the right place. And he actually says, I don't think that the laws of slavery should be thought of as this as something that we shouldn't pay attention to, because he thinks it has something to say about workers' rights. That you're not supposed to abuse your slave, you're not supposed to abuse your worker. You're not supposed to treat them as if they're nothing, as if you should treat them as if, he says, they belong to you, which he thinks psychologically will change an employer relationship as to the better, which is a thought that you have to really unpack of how that could be. But he thinks that if you own something, you don't think of them as an object, but you'll think of them as a value, as a possession that you don't want to abuse. Okay, so you might accept that, you might not, but he thought that there's a lot in these laws that tell us about workers' rights, making sure that people in the mines aren't just killed every day because, hey, they don't belong to me. They're their own person. They're making these decisions. And nowadays we have a lot of workers' rights and a lot of safety precautions that are put into many different workplaces in order to make sure that people are safe. And who knows, maybe that was because of the biblical ideal.
Interesting. Now, how does Rav Kook balance this idea of sort of an evolutionary morality where later generations grow in their moral sense, and the classic idea of Yeridat HaDorot, which is that the earlier generations were greater than the later generations? Those seem to go in opposite directions.
So he actually does mention that idea in this book when he's talking about the authority of the Sanhedrin to decide when there is a center in Jerusalem, when there is a temple rebuilt, and there is an accepted center of the Jewish people, that they would be able to relook at the laws of the Torah and understand them in a different light than maybe the rabbis of the Talmud would have. So he's conceding to this possibility that the laws could change. How would that occur? How does that fit with Yeridat HaDorot, the descent of generations? He says, it happens to be true. It happens to be that they were much smarter than us in many different ways. But does that affect the way that we are supposed to use the law? Yiftach b'doro kishmo b'doro, right? There's this idea that you deal with the generation that you have. The rabbis are not supposed to look at previous generations and say, it's off limits to us to be able to interpret the Torah according to the way we see it today.
But wait. Wouldn't it mean that if I say the earlier generations were smarter than we are, they were better than we are in general, they were closer to the Torah than we are, if that's the case, then if I say this seems to me to be unethical or immoral, wouldn't the logical response be to say, well, obviously I'm wrong. And even though, yes, Yiftach b'doro kishmo b'doro, which is that I have to look at the world today, but on a moral level, for me to imply that I'm more moral than they are because I'm going to outlaw something which they allowed, slavery is an example, there are plenty of other examples we can look at also, isn't that contradictory?
Right. So this is a sticky area for Rav Kook, where he's trying to balance the traditional understanding of the rabbis in respect for Chazal, but on the other hand, respect the inner moral intuition of the person. How do you do that? And so he says it's possible that we stand upon a truth that they just did not have access to, that we were granted a new understanding through discoveries empirically, through discoveries of the heart, that they just didn't have access to because it wasn't as developed. The morality did not have the opportunity over the course of the, let's call it the evolution of time, to change in the way that, or to evolve in the way that would develop in a way that the Jewish people would view things slightly differently or very differently from the time of Chazal.
Okay. Almost like standing on the shoulders of giants. Doesn't mean they're not giants, but we can see further in certain areas.
Very good. Yes, exactly.
Okay, let me ask you about heresy. And Rav Kook has an interesting view of heresy in the sense that he doesn't reject it as complete nonsense. He says it actually serves an important role. It helps us to expose childish and immature theology. So can you talk about that, elaborate upon that a little bit?
Yeah, that's all over this book is him talking about that because that's who he's thinking about in writing this book. He's not just, he's thinking about somebody who says, well, how can I accept the Torah? I don't believe in God. And Rav Kook over and over again deals with the issue of, hold on a second. You say that you don't believe in God. Do you mean that you believe that there is no God or that you don't believe in God? Because those are two different things. If you don't believe in God, that means you lack a belief. You have what we might call, definitely not how the Rambam understood it, how my mind is understood, but we might call it a negative theology. But if you say, I do not believe, I believe that there is no God, that's a categorical atheism. That is something that is completely evil because he says the only way a person can say there is definitely no God is if he is trying to ignore his heart. He's trying to ignore what he knows intuitively. Rav Kook believes that you can be an agnostic. You can believe that, I don't know if there's a God, I don't know. It wouldn't be so bad for Rav Kook because a person who doesn't know is curious, is trying to figure it out, is trying to get answers. And he'll ask questions to the rabbi. He'll ask questions to the theologian and say, if there's a God, why this, and this? And the rabbi or the theologian, the person who he's asking can respond, well, there are different ways to view this. And if you believe in this, then this, and right? You can have a conversation. A person who doesn't believe in God whatsoever, I should say, believes that there is no God, what conversation can you have? Either you believe in God or something else. You can't have a conversation where you prove God's existence for Rav Kook. It's not given to empirical observation, but he does say it's hard for him to imagine somebody who looks at the history of the Jewish people and says, there must be no God. How can you look at the Torah, which gives such a detailed description of the history of the Jewish people, where they went from camp to camp, how many people were there, and so detailed and so wondrous in its preciseness, that how can somebody doubt this, that God isn't here and that God has given this Torah to us? Will that convince the person who's agnostic or atheist? Probably not. But he says the person who looks at the Torah and is blown away by that could never come away with the feeling, I don't know, I'm not sure.
So what does he mean by childish theology, though?
Okay. So let's return to that. So Rav Kook says, you ask those questions, those that you have these notions from when you're a little kid about what God is. You might have heard the song, Hashem is here, Hashem is there, Hashem is truly everywhere, and up, up, down, down, right? So the Rav Kook has a belief in that God is truly everywhere. In a way that, do we exist? In what way do we exist? There's an interesting question in reference to this. But godliness and divinity is everywhere. A person grows up with a kind of theology that he doesn't really believe this. He kind of accepts such an idea if he's taught it in maybe a Chabad camp or something like that. But most of the time, a person is taught a type of God who punishes you if you do bad things and rewards you if you do good things. And you can't make sense of the world because of this kind of childish theology of this immature ideas about the way that God runs the world. And so he says, what you have to do is deepen that. And so the way that the person who's questioning asks these questions, Why do bad things happen to good people? Where is God in this thing? How can I understand history with God working behind the scenes when I don't see him, when I don't experience him? What about these scientific ideas? And you say, well, if you understand the mode of everything that's going on in our world and you look at the history, how can you not see divinity there? And you respond to each question according to the questioner. You can raise up their childish theology to one that's very mature. And so they ask the questions that actually help us develop our theology in a way that is much better, much more mature. He felt that that was a way of being able to, that they have this value to them. There's a story, I think it's said from Menachem Mendel of Kotsk, that somebody asked him in the classroom, what do you think about the atheists? And Rav Menachem Mendel said, the God they don't believe in, I don't believe in either. Meaning the criticisms they have against God are valid criticisms if you believe in a God that's not impervious to such criticisms, that can be affected by such criticism. And he said, but the criticisms are all based on an idea of God that I don't even believe in. So it's very interesting that Rav Kook has this kind of similar idea as well.
Very interesting. Rabbi Sklar, as we get close to the end, we are approaching the Yamim Noraim, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So I'd like to know if there's anything in particular in L'Nevuchei HaDor that relates to Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur that you'd like to share with us right now.
Sure. A lot of people are learning Orod HaTeshuva, which Rav Kook started to write and then was developed by his son. A lot of the ways that we talked about before of his son taking a lot of his writings. And they're learning that because Rav Kook has this idea of this return that's very optimistic, a return to the self. Rav Kook talks about this a lot in L'Nevuchei HaDor. In fact, I did a quick search before we started talking about how many times he uses the word repent or repentance, as in the word teshuva, in L'Nevuchei HaDor. It's exactly 20 times. I don't know if there's any significance to that, if it's on purpose. It happens to be a round number, exactly 20 times. And he talks about repentance a lot. One of the ideas of repentance that he talks about, a tremendous amount in this book, is the idea that we find in our Amidah, the tefillah that we say every day, 3 times a day, that where we put 2 brachot next to each other, 2 blessings. One is about knowledge, and then one is about repentance. The one about knowledge comes first. And the Gemara, the Talmud says that you have to have knowledge before you can repent, before you can do away from evil and gain atonement. And so Rav Kook says that that's the program that we should be doing. This is what L'Nevuchei HaDor is really about, too. We should be fixing our ideas or learning more, maturing our ideas, and through that we can come to a repentance. Because a lot of times, says Rav Kook, the reason why we act in the ways that we do is from a lack of knowledge, from an ignorance of what's really going on in our lives, about ourselves. And as we gain more knowledge and gain better understanding of ourselves and our lives, we're able to have a much better repentance, a much fuller teshuva. And so I think this is a powerful idea as we're getting into Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, that we should learn more, we should gain more knowledge, we should read books like L'Nevuchei HaDor, and through that we will have a full repentance and be full and united as a Jewish people.
Beautiful idea. Thank you very much. Just one last point. If people want to pre-order the book, when is the book being released and how can they do so?
We put it on the website as being released this fall. So within the next 2 months or so, we'll be on the shelves of bookstores. At this point, you can pre-order at kodeshpress.com, and we'll put some kind of link in the show notes, I hope, for a special discount for those who are listeners and followers of the Orthodox Conundrum podcast.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Rabbi Sklar, it is a pleasure to talk to you, and it's a pleasure to hear about the incredible work you did, bringing Rav Kook's ideas to people who otherwise would not have access to them, particularly this book, L'Nevuchei HaDor, which was hidden for so long, and that was finally out. And people should be inspired, as you said, by Rav Kook's mechanisms and methodologies as much as by his answers, as well as by his answers. And for that, I also want to thank you personally for bringing this to the people, to allow so many more people to have access. I think it's a wonderful thing you're doing, and I appreciate your sharing it today with my listeners. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Would you appreciate real and honest conversation about how we actually live and experience mitzvot day to day? I'm excited to introduce Women Talking Mitzvot, a new podcast co-produced by L'Nevuchei and Beit Midrash Migdal Oz. In each episode, Rabbanit Shana Goldberg and Rabbanit Dr. Yosefa Fogel-Rubel explore both the texts and the lived experiences of women keeping halacha. They go beyond the sources to ask what it means to take mitzvot seriously without shying away from real-life challenges. And they make it relevant for men as well. Whether you're looking for spiritual or intellectual insight, or just a voice that resonates, Women Talking Mitzvot offers meaningful, grounded conversation, rooted in Torah and lived with authenticity. Listen on your favorite podcast app, or visit deracheha.org. That's DERACHEHA.org. And look out for special episodes going up for Elul and the Yamim Noraim that you do not want to miss. Women Talking Mitzvot. You can find the link in the description of this podcast. Before we sign off, a brief word of thanks. Several new listeners have joined our Patreon, and I'm genuinely grateful. You're not buying bonus episodes. You're underwriting the work, the research, editing, and the independence that lets us ask hard questions with respect and clarity. If today's conversation helped you think more carefully about Torah, community, and the world we inhabit, please consider becoming a patron. Even a small monthly contribution makes a real difference in keeping the Orthodox Conundrum going and accessible to everyone. The link is in the show notes. To those who have already joined, thank you. Your vote of confidence means more than you know. And to everyone else, I hope you'll consider joining us. Subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA@jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been the Orthodox Conundrum on jewishcoffeehouse.com.